Hello, my name is Simon Trace and I'm a principal consultant at Oxford Policy Management, and I'm also the program director for the Energy and Economic Growth Applied Research Program, which is otherwise known as EEG, and that's what I'll be referring to from now on. I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar to look at the evidence around whether energy access promotes economic growth. But I should say maybe at the outset that we may well stray beyond economic growth and into sort of social as well as economic development impacts of electrification in our conversation today. This webinar is one of a series that's been hosted by EEG, which itself is a 5-year program funded by the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office. The overall aim of the programme is to build a body of evidence around how sector reforms and innovative technologies and practical actions can be used to help maximise the economic impacts of larger scale energy projects across sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, and to bring benefits of modern energy services to poorer people. We have sponsored so far just under, I think it's 30 substantive research projects, some of which are going to be represented by panel members here today. And they cover a range of themes, including sort of increasing access to the grid, the impacts of unreliable grid supplies, improvements in energy efficiency and the productive use of electricity, and challenges around incorporating large-scale renewable generation into grid supplies. I'm joined today from EEG by my colleague Ben Kloos, who's the head of research and engagement for EEG, and he's going to be helping me field questions to the panel from you, the audience, today. That leads me on then to introductions for our distinguished panel members themselves. So let me do that. I'm very pleased and honoured to be joined today by the following people. First, Dr. Kenneth Lee, who's an accomplished economist with broad experience across the energy sector and beyond. He's currently the director of the Air Quality Life Index, developed by economists at the University of Chicago. Prior to this, he was executive director of the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago in India. Ken's authored a state of knowledge paper on energy and economic growth for our project for the EEG, but he's also the author of a widely cited paper, Does Household Electrification Supercharge Economic Development, published in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, which, spoiler alert, finds limited evidence of electricity changing poor people's lives. Dr. Dana Kassam is a researcher at the Department of Economics, University of Mannheim, and also a fellow of the Energy for Growth Hub. Dana's research is at the intersection between energy and environmental economics and development economics, with a special focus on how resources can drive growth and externalities that this growth creates. She is the author of a working paper, Does Electrification Cause Industrial Development, Grid Expansion and Firm Turnover in Indonesia? And we'll be referencing that through our discussion today. Dr. Robin Meeks is an assistant professor at the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. Her research is at the intersection of environmental and development economics, and with much of her work focusing on understanding individual, household and firm responses to the introduction of various water and energy technologies, policies and types of infrastructure in developing countries. She is the principal investigator for an EEG research project on the role of metering and infrastructure improvements in power system resilience during COVID-19. But she will be speaking today about her non-EEG funded work, largely in Nepal, around electrification and manufacturing growth. Dr. Martin Voors is an associate professor at the Development Economics Group at Wageningen University in Holland. His main field of development is development economics, with recent projects focusing on institutions in development, rural electrification and deforestation. Martin is a principal investigator, or the principal investigator, on the EEG project, Electrifying Growth, Electricity Access for Productive Use in Sierra Leone. And then finally, on our panel, we have Dr. Clark Miller, who's a professor at the Arizona State University School for the Future Innovation in Society and director for the Center for Energy and Society. The center's research focuses on the sort of social drivers and dynamics and consequences of large-scale transformations in the energy sector and the opportunities to enhance the societal benefits and outcomes that derive from the clean energy revolution. Clark is a principal investigator on the EEG project, improving social and economic impact of energy infrastructure investments in Sierra Leone through enhancement of social value creation, capacity building, and decision support. So that's our panel, and I'd really like to thank all of them for taking time out to be with us today. Finally, just before we start, I need to explain the format for today's event. We're aiming for a panel discussion on the topic of energy access and economic growth, rather than a sort of set of presentations followed by questions. You will be able to hear and see the panel, but as attendees, you yourselves will not be visible or audible. But we do want to encourage participation from the attendees, however. So I'd really urge you to please ask questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. Please also feel free to add your vote to questions that others have logged in the Q&A so, that you think are important. My colleague Ben will then be collecting questions as we go. And once I've been round the panelists to ask them my opening questions, I'm going to turn to Ben every so often to start feeding in questions from the floor. So please do use that. If you have comments and reflections rather than questions, please feel free to post them in the chat facility. We'll also be posting information about and links to the panelists' research in the chat facility as the event progresses. Yeah, and I should let you know that the webinar is being recorded and that it will be made available through the EEG's website. So without further ado, let me start the conversation by turning to Ken. Ken, thanks for joining us today, along with all the other panelists. Thanks. You co-authored a state of knowledge paper for EEG, as I said, with Catherine Wolfram and others back in 2017 around sort of electrification and economic development from a microeconomic perspective. But your paper, I think, originally produced in 2016 around Kenya, where you were using sort of demand and cost curves to show that sort of high costs and low usage meant that rural electrification didn't really produce the benefits expected, and actually, I mean, I think you actually argued reduced welfare. Can you talk us a bit about your work in Kenya and the research that led you to that conclusion?
Sure. Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So we first began studying the relationship between access to electricity and economic development in 2012, about a decade ago. And at the time, there was a relatively large literature showing that access to electricity is this critical driver of economic development. If you provide households with power, you'd see increases in income, consumption, labor supply, and so on. Our view is that a number of these earlier studies, which tended to use administrative or observational data, relied on relatively strong econometric assumptions. In many cases, you could imagine some unobserved factor that might be correlated with the household gaining access to power, as well as the economic improvements that might occur in the household over time. And so these kinds of possibilities raised questions about whether the earlier literature had captured pure causal effects or had captured correlations or associated relationships. So around that time, along with my co-authors, Ted, Miguel, and Catherine Wolfram at UC Berkeley, we set out to answer this question of what is the direct effect of electricity access on household living standards. And we designed an experiment to connect hundreds of rural households in Kenya to the national grid for the first time. We had a sample of households. It was divided into treatment and control groups. Randomly, treatment groups were offered different kinds of discounts to connect to the national grid. And then the control group was offered just the standard status quo prices. And random variation in the prices of connections that we offered allowed us to trace out a demand curve and experimental cost curves. We also surveyed households after 18 months or so, collecting data on a bunch of different outcomes, like whether or not they were employed, what kinds of assets they owned. And we also gave children in their households verbal and math tests as well, just to see if there were any differences in educational outcomes. And so when we analyzed the data, we found that there were really no differences between the treatment households and the control households. The connections cost the government of Kenya a lot of money, about $1,000 or over $1,000 per household. Yet connected households seemed no better off than the unconnected households. So we examined a bunch of different possibilities of of why this could be the case. But essentially, just to kind of wrap this up, we landed on the kind of main takeaway that providing households with access to electricity alone is really not enough to drive economic development outcomes in a meaningful way. Electricity access is only useful if there are ways to use it. And so in many of these places in Western Kenya, where people are quite poor, subsistence agriculture, there really aren't that many ways to use these power connections. And I think that's why we did not see impacts in the time frame that we studied. So to bring things sort of back around full circle, I think that much of the focus now has shifted from trying to answer this question of what are the impacts of electrification to how do we unlock the productive benefits of electrification, since you really do need to combine these power connections with something else. So the conclusion that you referred to about the sort of welfare implications of rapid mass electrification is really that if you deliver universal access to power without focusing on offering these complementarities, then yeah, it might not return the kinds of benefits that you would expect.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ken. I mean, just to pick up on one of your earlier points, and just for clarity, I mean, the sort of general acceptance in the development community that energy access does lead to benefits in terms of sort of education and health and employment. You're kind of saying that you think that a lot of those studies are mistaking correlation for causality, and that was where your study sort of looked in more depth, was to actually look at the flow of causation.
Yeah, well, so I think it's undeniable that there is a high correlation between energy access and levels of education, health, employment, as you say. When we're talking about causal effects, I think that a lot of the earlier literature relied on observational data, non-experimental situations. And so it is very difficult in those situations to analyze the data in a way where you could account for every possible factor that might be driving changes in economic development outcomes. It's just very hard to do that. Like if you look at an electrification program, in India, for example, maybe that's being combined with other investments in regional road infrastructure networks. And typically infrastructure programs are paired together. So both of those are inputs that might be improving livelihoods. And so it's hard to isolate the effect of the power connection alone. So I don't think that there's a question about whether or not these things are related. It's really when our job as microeconomists is to try to isolate the impacts of specific variables. And so when you do that, when you look at some of the newer literature that deploys these quasi-experimental or experimental methodologies, you find that they're estimating much smaller effects. And I think the reason why is because they are doing a better job at isolating the effect of that one variable alone. And so what does this mean in terms of policy decisions? I think it means that as governments seek to pursue universal access to electricity, they really need to be thinking about what are people going to do with that power? How do we unlock the productive benefits of that power? Does this mean we need to distribute appliance subsidies so that people have things to use that power for? Or does this mean that we have to invest in other kinds of infrastructure that could make that power more beneficial for commercial activities?
Thanks, Ken. We'll come back to some of those points in a minute. I want to move on to Martin now, if I can. Martin, you've been running a large sort of RCT study of the impact of electrification on rural health posts in Sierra Leone, and sort of comparing clinics with access to power, mostly from mini grids, I think, with similar communities that don't have. I think you've also done some work sort of looking at broader sort of economic sort of indicators in the study as well. So could you say a little bit about what you found? But first of all, I guess on the rural health post, but then more broadly on sort of economic indicators. and the some differences or lack of differences between treatment and control communities.
Yeah, thanks, Simon, and great to be on this panel. And thanks for inviting me. So, so the project we got engaged with was, as donors in many lower-income countries started to embrace this idea of energy access more and more. Some have read Ken's work, and some maybe haven't. At least it came with let's beef up sort of our ability to supply power. And what they chose in Sierra Leone, the country where we got engaged as a research group, was FCDO and the government sponsoring the creation of mini grids. So mini grids are, in a sense, a panel of solar panels, a field of solar panels with a battery house, anywhere between 20 and 36 kilowatts at peak. And so the idea being then we can sell off sort of the ability to create connections to households through operators, but that the school and the clinic would get access for free. Now, we're following the project, and the nice thing about teaming up in this sort of when this change is happening is that we could at least collect data before the mini grids were installed, and we've been able to do a sort of short run follow up on the same clinics and as you said, the wider community. We're planning to follow up more. One correction on your introduction, it wasn't an RCD. So here the government really went for trying to, we don't quite know exactly, of course, what was the decision, the allocation rule. We have some sense of this, but to benefit X number of towns spread out across the country, but at least we're able to sort of select as good as possible comparison sites, because we were able to select on the basis of data from before. Now, so with that, grain or, if you will, bucket of salt in mind, we're able to sort of track changes, not just between places, but between places over time, right? So we can't control where they were placed, but we can at least see how the differences and changes are happening. Now, for clinics, what was interesting is that it seems sort of, and same thing is for household, kind of like they're promising signs, but it's no big sign of larger changes in terms of health or in terms of structurally changing local economies or the types of things that Ken was talking about. So the results are really resonate with the points about Kenya. So in clinics, what you see is that there's some increased investments in the appliances that they have. So that's a major bump. You see the number of sort of cold storage possibilities and freezers and fridges increases, and we see the number of vaccines and drugs on store increase, which is great. Also, if you think about potentially interventions now around the pandemic. But if you think about utilization or opening hours or offering additional services, they haven't changed, right? So for many of these clinics, it sort of means, of course, that even though you have light and there may be some increase in investments in terms of what you can do at the clinic in terms of quality, it doesn't translate yet at all in terms of how many people you serve and how many people you can help, or at least, and then further down health levels. So the signaling that, of course, the other problems haven't been solved. There's still a lack of support for nurses. There, in terms of their salary, there's still a lack of career possibilities. There's still lots of structural problems that, again, this message that electricity is an enabler, but it doesn't, of course, miraculously change everything. And quickly on sort of the wider community. So what we did is tracking what happens in these clinics, comparison clinics over time. We did the same with randomly selected households within communities. And there you see that there's uptake. So it's nice. So people start getting connections much more on the sites where mini grids are built, right? So that is good. And they move away from fossil fuels more in terms of their expenditure and in terms of their use for lightning and some other, in charcoal and firewood go down. Except it doesn't really translate into incomes or food security or poverty. We see some more businesses use electricity, but it doesn't change what their inputs or their outputs or their turnover or their profits. So who knows what happens in the longer run? I don't want to sort of say, well, this is what you're going to get if you just focus on energy alone. But I do think a lot of what Ken was saying in terms of complementarities are a necessary requirement if we wanted to boost that up over the longer run. We see a shorter run, right? So over the longer run, we see changes happening. There's lots of evidence out there that these things correlate well over time, except in the shorter run, the gains may be not that immediate.
And I mean, just very briefly, so one of the things that Ken was saying, and I guess you're also echoing, is what are the additionalities, the enablers that alongside electricity actually make that difference? And you're just in the process now of setting up a field experiment to look at how the impact of access to productive appliances might change some of those things. Can you just really briefly just describe what you're doing? I know we
Yeah. So the two things that we've been thinking about, also inspired by Ken's work, has been, okay, so of course you're looking at a world that doesn't exist yet, right? The appliances aren't yet in communities, but it isn't just appliances. The second one is access to markets. What are you going to do when you have appliances, let's say, that change your productivity in agriculture or changes further down the value chain in agriculture? What are you going to do if you don't have increased access to markets? So the two types of things we've been thinking about is, how can we think of productive use, so energy dependent appliances, and make those available? So there we can look at the space of villages where energy is available, and then think about, similarly getting a sort of the demand curve for various types of energy dependent appliances, right? So we can figure out type of appliances that are in demand that may actually produce productive in a second stage. But at the same time, we're thinking about ways in which maybe that in combination with market access could help change the way local communities are organized and how businesses and farmers change incomes.
Cool. Thanks, Martin. We'll come back again later on this. I'm now going to shift to a couple of speakers that maybe have sort of detected more positive correlations or causalities. And we'll just hear from them. So Dana, I want to ask you first. You've looked at the impact of expansion of grid electrification on industrial development in Indonesia, and by contrast to previous speakers, you have seen some positive, notable impacts, I think, related to the number of manufacturing firms, workers, and outputs when firms are connected to grid supplies. Can you sort of just talk us through briefly your findings?
Yes, sure. And thank you very much for having me at this panel. I'm very happy to be here. So in my research on Indonesia, I ask whether electrification truly drives industrialization, or whether this relationship is, as you said, just a correlation along the path for development. And as Ken and Martin have just discussed, the answer to this question is really not trivial and not necessarily affirmative. So to answer this question, I spent some time in Indonesia collecting and digitizing data about the electrification infrastructure, which allowed me to look at how the evolution of the electric grid during the 1990s in Java, which is the main island in Indonesia, affected manufacturing activity. And I used the data from the large and medium manufacturing census. And just briefly, so what I find is that electrification does indeed cause industrialization, and the main channel is firm entry. So what happens is that when a location gets electrified, it makes it more attractive for entrepreneurs to start their business in that location, which increasing the number of new firms, and thus the total number of manufacturing firms, manufacturing output, but also the people working in the manufacturing sector. And this higher number of firms in the market leads to a tougher competitive environment, meaning that unproductive firms that were able to survive before electrification are now unable to do so, which translated into an increase in exit rates and higher average productivity in the market. And really, most of the increase in output induced by electrification I see is due to firm entry rather than improvements in the output of firms that existed before and survived. So it's really that entry channel that is driving the growth.
Okay, no, I mean that's really interesting. I mean, so that's a different finding in some senses from what Martin and Kenneth were talking about, but they were, I guess, talking more about the household level, and you're talking about the manufacturing level. And I mean, do you think that's part of the explanation, that there's sort of something fundamentally different about looking at the impact of access to electricity on firms' outputs and productivities as opposed to sort of household income?
Yeah, so I don't think there's something fundamentally different about firms. And in principle, I would expect households to experience some of these measured benefits of the industrial sector. And needless to say, Java, Indonesia in the 90s is different than sub-Saharan Africa, but I think there are some lessons that we could learn about the impact of electrification in general. And I think there are at least 3 contributing factors to why we might not be seeing these positive effects of electrification in different contexts. First, so the results I find, if we look at them through the lens of economic theory, they tell us that the lack of electricity in Indonesia was an entry barrier for industrial firms. And in that particular context of Indonesia, in the absence of the grid, firms had to rely on self-generation to produce, so they had to have their own generators. Which is quite expensive. And with electrification, the possibility of having access to the grid instead of buying your own generator is really what attracted the new firms. So it's this entry channel that drives the impact of electrification on the industrial sector. And what that implies, I think, for the sort of general impact of electrification is that without the possibility of entry, say, for example, if there are other non-energy barriers to entry, such as credit constraints or inadequate transportation infrastructure or other barriers to market access that Marta just mentioned, for example, it is unlikely that electrification will transform the industrial sector. So it may well be that electrification alone is not enough to supercharge industrialization. And a second reason, I think, is the methodological scope of the studies. And then Ken mentioned this a few times. So the gold standard in impact evaluations is randomized controlled trials, or RCTs. And while natural experiments or observational studies like the one I exploit in my Indonesia study have their disadvantages relative to randomized controlled trials, they allow us to capture certain margins in a way that is not possible in randomized experiments, at least not in a sort of practical and cheap way. So just to give a simple example, if you want to measure the impact of electrification on the industrial sector with an RCT, we could, for example, experimentally vary a subsidized connection fee to a group of firms in a way that is analogous to what Ken and his co-authors did in Kenya. What this will give us is a credible estimate of the effect of electricity on the firms themselves, but it will not capture the effect of electrification on, for example, firm entry, simply because these new firms don't exist yet. And similarly, we would not maybe be able to capture community level effects with such a design. So what we would need instead is a design where we randomly place the grid in different areas of the country, which is, needless to say, infeasible or at least impractical and would cost a lot of money. So it is possible that there are some positive effects in the aggregate, but we are not always capturing them. A third reason is really the time span. I find in Indonesia actually that the impact of electrification grows over time. So maybe we just need to wait a few more years for the benefits of electrification to materialize.
Okay, we'll come back to that last question, that last point again in a minute from another study in Nepal. But talking Nepal, thanks Dana, that was really helpful. I'd like to now turn to Robin. You've looked at the impacts of microhydro projects in Nepal, and again, you've seen some evidence of access to electricity helping grow the manufacturing sector and some shifts in labour from self-employment and agriculture to employment in wages or salaries. So can you just talk us through those findings a little bit, please?
Yes, I'm happy to. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about this today. So with my co-authors, we have studied the rapid increase in construction of microhydro mini grids in Nepal over the past 15 years or so. And we're looking at the impacts on manufacturing and labor outcomes. And so when you think about microhydro mini grids, you can think about they have generation capacities up to 100 kilowatts, but in our setting, the average system capacity is approximately 38 kilowatts. So we're thinking about sort of systems that are able to power activities such as sawing and milling activities, sewing facilities, food processing facilities, mechanical workshops, and the like, okay? And Nepal is a really interesting place, I think, to be studying the topic of mini-grids because mini-grids have played a large role in the rapid increase in electrification in the country. So it has about an estimated 1,500 mini-grids installed in the country, which makes, according to some estimates, up to sort of the fourth highest number of mini-grids in the world of any country. So what we're doing with our study, and sort of like the previous study that was discussed, we're talking about a natural experiment, not a randomized experiment, sort of. And so we're using, in our study, we're using the processes that were developed to rapidly increase the microhydro mini-grid construction in the country. And so what was done for that was a GIS study was launched back in about 2005, 2006, where there was work done to locate through this GIS study locations that were geophysically appropriate for microhydro mini-grids. So certain characteristics, such as the presence of year-round river flow, a particular slope along the river, make locations particularly amenable or geophysically appropriate for microhydro mini-grids. And so we use data on the locations that were identified as being geophysically appropriate for the microhydro mini-grids. And then we have data on where microhydro mini-grids were actually constructed during this time period. And we use those data in conjunction with data from the Central Bureau of Statistics. So sort of like the prior study, we digitized data on manufacturing establishments. And we have a panel data set that we've created from 2006, 2012, and 2018 that has formal manufacturing establishments that are employing 10 or more individuals. So we're able to create this panel data set on manufacturing establishments to look at the impacts of these microhydro mini-grids on manufacturing, okay? And so one thing to note is that the baseline numbers are really low in terms of the baseline numbers of manufacturing establishments in these settings. So sort of baseline before the microhydro mini-grids, approximately 1 in 5 villages in our sample had a manufacturing establishment of this size, so 10 or more employees that were hired by the establishment. And this is just a function of the data. That's sort of where the cutoff at which they are measuring and collecting this in the data. So we can't say anything, unfortunately, about the smaller establishments. So for our results, we're finding that first, the rural electrification through the microhydro mini-grids is leading to a statistically significant increase in the formal manufacturing establishments. So our most recent estimates are suggesting that one additional microhydro mini-grid per municipality can increase the number of enterprises by 27 to 40%, which sounds really great. The sort of caveat is that given these very low baseline numbers, that the overall presence, even with this increase, the overall presence of the manufacturing establishments remains quite low in these settings, even after the microhydro is constructed. So our estimates indicate that it's about 1 in 3 municipalities would have one of these manufacturing establishments after the microhydro. So it's still limited. I would just note sort of that because of the data, we can't capture these smaller enterprises. So you could imagine in these settings that there's a large number of enterprises that hire less than 10 individuals, and we're not capturing this in our data set. And you could also imagine that there's informal establishments that are also being impacted by the electrification. We have some supplemental evidence from some survey data sets that suggest that there was an increase in small non-agricultural and sort of typically informal household enterprises. But those results are not as well identified econometrically as our other results. So we sort of interpret them as being speculative. Our other main finding is that we are seeing a shift in labor based on census microdata that we have for 2001 and 2011. So we're seeing that individuals' labor is shifting away from self-employment and agricultural work towards working for salary or wages. And we think that given the sort of relatively strong numbers we're seeing in the labor outcomes, that these labor outcomes are being driven not only by the manufacturing establishments that are 10 or more individuals, but also the smaller enterprises, and the informal enterprises must also be contributing to these labor shifts.
And you're also seeing a sort of effect around remoteness of communities, so which would suggest that other infrastructure plays an important role in growth of enterprises. Do you want to just say something briefly about that?
Right. So one of the, I think, cool things about looking at these microhydro mini grids is they can be constructed in places that are very remote. They can also be constructed in places that are not as remote, that are sort of not so far from where the historical grid is located. So it allows us to be able to do this analysis, looking at heterogeneity and the impacts on manufacturing based on sort of proximity to the historical grid. So we look at the impacts for very remote microhydro mini grids, and then some of those microhydro mini grids that are built in closer proximity to the historical grid. And we find that the impacts are significantly less in the very remote areas. And what I think is happening here really ties into what I think Martin and Ken have been mentioning earlier, in that these places that are closer to the historical grid are closer to markets, developed markets, right? And so this means that when the microhydro mini grids are constructed in these places that are less remote, these places have greater access to supplies, the things that would be used in the manufacturing process. And then they also have greater access to the markets in terms of selling the products that they're producing through the manufacturing process. So I think it really does sort of add another point of evidence in terms of thinking about the complementarities and market access that I think have been brought up earlier by others.
Great, thanks, Robin. I'm going to turn finally to Clark Miller, but just before I do that, I wanted to remind people in the audience, if you have any questions for the panelists, please do put them in the Q&A, because once I've asked my next sort of set of questions to Clark, I think we'll turn to those and before picking things up again. So Clark, I guess, yeah, I mean, I think you come to this from a slightly different angle, because you're particularly interested in the sort of social value of energy access, and I'm just wondering whether that as an analytical approach, provides a different view on where to look when you're trying to actually understand what the impacts of and the values of an electricity connection actually are. So maybe you could talk a bit to that analytical approach.
Thanks, Simon. It's great to be here and wonderful to hear all of the latest results from everybody else, because this is a super important topic, and a topic that, if we don't get right, we will not be able to translate success on SDG 7, assuming we get there, right? That we actually make access happen universally. We won't be able to translate it into real impact in a lot of these communities if we don't get this right. And so our approach has been sort of to take all of this findings that other folks have been coming up with and ask, why is it that in some places this seems to happen, right? We seem to get these kind of good connections, and in other places it doesn't, and to try to build up theoretically and conceptually from the ground up, how do we understand and explain these kind of differences between what's happening in different places? And what we have sort of found in doing that work is that it really depends a lot on how energy projects are designed, and particularly how they're designed in relationship to the use of energy and the ability of users to use energy to create value in their own lives. And that's what we call the social value of energy. And that can be tangible energy, what Simon, in a lot of your earlier work, you called productive value. It can be commercial and industrial value, as Robin and Dana have been emphasizing. It also includes what Amartya Sen would call improving capabilities, right? The ability to do things that create well-being and thriving. And all of that requires energy, but it requires not just energy, it requires that capability, which is a set of knowledge and skills. It's a set of contextual opportunities that are provided by markets or provided by political systems. And it's a set of actual technical design features that allow for users to use that energy in ways that that generate that value. So that's the first sort of design criteria that we emphasize is you really got to shift focus from these supply side metrics. Do they have electricity or not? Do they have high quality energy services being delivered to them, right? To thinking about user side metrics that focus on the ability, the capability to use energy to create value. The second sort of key design criteria is that, of course, all energy systems impose costs and burdens and risks and fees on users and on communities. And so you have to understand those dynamics as well, right? In other words, what are the ways in which the energy system is simultaneously extracting value from the communities? And you've got to do project design in a way that minimizes that extractive or value destructive kind of element of energy systems so that it's below the level of social value creation, right? Because otherwise the net balance between sort of value creation and value extraction becomes negative, and then you get a negative feedback loop, and that erodes well-being over time. And we certainly see that, especially in extremely low-income communities. Or it just leads to, for example, situations like we've seen in many places where you bring electricity and nobody ever uses it because it's just too costly for them to do so, right? And then the third design criteria that we have really focused on is thinking about energy as not just a commodity, but as a system, and thinking about how ownership and workforce development and other kinds of opportunities for reinvestment locally are designed into the energy system itself. In other words, are the benefits of employment in the design of that energy project flowing to outsiders, or are they flowing to insiders? Are there ways in which the system is designed so that it reinvests in communities over time? For example, taking revenues from the energy system and investing them deliberately in entrepreneurial activity in the community, for example. So with these three kind of design criteria, you can approach the design of energy projects so that you're not just delivering electricity, but you're delivering real opportunities and real capabilities for value creation in the community.
And the EEG project that you have in Sierra Leone, is that trying to do, I mean, can you talk just very briefly, can you just talk about what you're trying to measure or to ascertain there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so what we're doing there really has kind of three objectives. The first is to, I would say further develop and systematize our methods for understanding what social value creation looks like with energy systems in diverse communities. And ultimately, ideally, we'd love to be able to quantify at least some aspects of that so that energy project designers can measure in meaningful engineering terms sort of what they're being able to accomplish with their projects. The second is that we're focused on trying to understand comparatively how social value creation occurs in different kinds of contexts. So we have dense urban areas, we have outlying towns and small cities areas, and emerging grid areas. And then we have remote rural communities in the project as well. So what are the differences in how to think about social value creation in those different contexts? And then the third thing that we're doing is working with different government participants. So, you know, the utility companies, the regulators, and the ministry to try to understand how they might implement this or integrate. It's really about integrating this idea of social value creation into project design.
Great, thanks, Clark. We'll just take a quick pause there, and Ben, can you tell us anything about any of the questions in the Q&A that you might want to put?
Well, first of all, I think, as Simon said, a reminder to post questions and comments, indeed, that you may have in the chat or also the Q&A function. And there have been quite a few. I think there are probably two themes of questions emerging. Maybe starting with one where I think we've seen the most questions, and it's the question of how do you maximize the opportunities for electrification? So this touches on nexus issues of affordability versus reliability. What type of power is electricity actually appropriate? And then this question of, should we focus more on the technical solutions or the social benefits, and what does that imply for the type of investments? So I think the question to the panel here is, how much are each of these factors a barrier to achieving impact, or conversely, how much is what do we most need to focus on to maximize the benefits of access to electricity?
Does anyone want to have a first stab at that? Yeah, Martin?
Yeah, maybe I'll just pick up on your last point, because we have seen these mini grids being built right in front of our noses as part of the EEG project and over the last years. And one thing is building it, and engineers are very good at building things. Then the question is, how do you maintain it? And there the incentives are as important as the technical elements, right? So what types of batteries do you use to store energy, but also what modalities do you have, and who's in charge of the mini grid? But from the simplest thing, right? Who goes out there and takes off the dust? Whose responsibility is this? And how do you avoid that becoming politicized, right? There's a whole suite. So the answer, short answer, is it's both. It's both a technical challenge, right? How do you design systems that are sustainable over the longer run for the context where you are? How do you make them scalable? Isn't all that evident that you can keep scaling lithium batteries? So a lot of work needs to happen on that front. But at the same time, it's institutional and social and economic. Think about all the questions that were just raised on the panel. And so my final takeaway of that is, so often I am in a room with people who make technology. How do you call them? Technocrats? No, technology makers, engineers. And the question is, why isn't it working, right? And very often are the sort of the economic questions, and thinking about the economy, a separate entity, a separate work package, a separate organization than is the one, for example, in charge of building it, which is, in a sense, if you take everything we've heard already now at face value, that's a crazy idea. But it seems like much of the donor and the practitioners community is still sort of separated that way. So I think the answer is both, but in an integrated sense.
Great, thank you, Ken. Thank you, Martin. I'll go take Ken and then Clark.
Yeah, I just want to agree with Martin on this. So just thinking back to household access to grid electricity in our Kenya experiment, I mentioned that we're measuring the costs, that each connection costs like over $1,000. Well, as part of the connection process, we were documenting all of the issues that came up during this construction process where we're building, kilometers of power lines to people's homes. And one thing that we noticed was that something like 20 or 21% of the material that had been paid for and designed never actually made it to the field. And what that meant was that the end infrastructure that was actually put up was not as good as what was supposed to be put up. And we also measured reliability in our sites. We had something like 19% of transformers blacking out for many weeks at a time. So there are reliability issues, there are grid construction quality issues. There were also issues of households not being able to buy appliances or having very little money to pay for monthly electricity consumption. And so all of these sorts of issues may have led to the kinds of underwhelming results that we found in our study. And so if you think about Kenya, they had massive electrification over the past decade. They went from about 25% connected to 80% connected in 6 or 7 years. Just phenomenal, rate of electrification. It was a very politically program, last mile connectivity project. It was in the newspapers. The president of Kenya was talking about bringing power to the people. And often it's very easy to measure the simple outcome of how many connections are in the field, but very difficult to measure these other things of how reliable is that connection? Are people able to use it and so on? And so I think we have to focus on, finding measures or holding governments accountable, like if you're the donor, holding governments accountable to delivering not just numbers of newly connected households, but also high quality connections that could actually be used.
Thank you, Ken. I think Clark, you were up next.
Yeah, thanks. And I think really important observations from both Martin and Ken about the kind of technical design and delivery and implementation on these projects. But I would just add that we almost never think about these projects, particularly, for example, if you're looking at a big bank that's looking at investing in substantially in major electrification kinds of projects, right? They are going to ask hard questions about kind of the technologies that are going to be delivered and where they're going to be delivered and how they're going to be put in and where they're what the cost of all of that is going to be. And there's remarkably little attention to kind of the human design side of the project, right? The idea that there's a huge set of kind of capability upgrades that are needed in terms of being able to translate electricity access into value, whatever kind of value you're interested in, whether it's improved healthcare delivery or educational delivery, or it's creating small businesses or creating manufacturing in a new area. There's just a lot of work that has to get done in order for that to happen. And it's really quite remarkable to me that this doesn't get paid attention to, because it would have huge impacts on the bankability, if you will, of projects to be attending to these kinds of questions and the likelihood of return on investment in attention. And I think you could extend bankable projects into lots more areas if there was a clear focus on how do we ensure that the people and the businesses and the communities in these areas have these capabilities. And that's an integral part of the design, as Martin suggested, of the project, right? That it's not separated out, that it's not, that it's not included. I mean, there was we were working in Pakistan in one of the mountain regions along the Afghan border with a group, and they shared with us a government report on 1,000 microhydro projects that they were intending to build in that region. And there was 50 pages of detailed techno-economic analysis of these different sites and where they were going to put them, and demonstrating that there was enough water, and there was that it wasn't going to be impacted by seasonality and all these kind of things. And there were literally 3 bullet points about the social and economic design of the project, and they were copy and pasted from each to the next, and they said nothing. Right? So there was no analysis done of whether any of these communities were going to be in any kind of position to be able to use the energy productively, or what it would take from a human standpoint to make that happen.
Okay, we have 2 more hands up, but I'm also aware that we've got other questions from the audience. Maybe just very brief additions from Robin and Dana, and then we'll go on to the next question, please. Robin?
Yep. Great. So I did want to add 2 points, I think, to what has been said by my fellow panelists so far on this question. One is that, we have seen this also in the Nepal setting of some of the systems, if the microhydro mini grids are supposed to have a lifespan of 20 to 30 years, some of the systems are way outliving that lifespan. Others are not coming close to that length of lifespan. So we've been trying to do some follow-up work on what factors contribute to the sustained functionality of these systems, are correlated with sort of longer functionality of these systems. And I think sort of my sort of brief answer would be it's really complicated, right? And sort of in terms of the institutional and the financial aspects and the management aspects, it seems really complicated. So we're working on disentangling it, but I don't think that there's an easy answer. The second point that I wanted to make was following up on Ken's points about reliability. And I have other work that's looking at electricity reliability in Central Asia and Kyrgyzstan, and I think personally think this is a really important part of the equation, improving reliability. So we have some recent work where through an experimental design, we were able to assess the impacts of improving reliability. And we actually find that households then increase their electricity consumption and they invest more in appliances. And so if we're thinking about sort of ways to get people to have more end uses and invest more in end uses for electricity, then I think improving reliability plays a big role. I'll end it there.
Thank you. Dana, quick point, and then we'll go on to the next question.
Yes, so I think that was a good point to end on, Robin. So just to add the question of reliability and sort of the technical side of maintaining the system, as well as the financial sustainability and the economic side, is that when the systems are not reliable or there are outages, people who are already quite poor, or maybe they're not that poor, but they are still not willing maybe to pay their bills, or because the supply is not good, because they are not getting a good quality service, and that makes it sort of not very sustainable for the electricity companies, especially in settings where these are private companies, so they don't maintain their systems very well, which makes the supply even worse, and then you're getting stuck in this cycle. So yeah, this is just my 2 cents on the issue.
Absolutely. We have a whole stream of research that's looking exactly at reliability and that sort of vicious circle that you talk about there. Ben, can we maybe take one more question from the audience for now?
Yeah, I think the other question or group of questions that emerged is around the question of who benefits. And there's several ways this has been raised. One is around to what extent does location matter? So is it proximity to an existing grid versus rural, international versus domestic firms? Perhaps a broader question related to it is around the sample. Are we actually, to what extent are these findings sensitive to the specific sample you're studying and perhaps the methodology you're applying? So who benefits more is one of those questions beyond the how.
Okay, and I mean, I'd like to just add, because it's one of my questions as well, but sort of relates to that. You know, we're talking about energy supplies or electricity supplies here as if they are a single sort of recognizable thing, but obviously they come in very different shapes and sizes. We have the tier structure from SMAP, which looks at sort of 5 different levels of supply from a very, well, tier 0 at 6, if you include tier 0. Tier 0 is none. You know, tier 1 might be just a solar lantern. Tier 5 would be grid equivalent 24-hour supply. So, you know, when we're talking about electricity supply, we're often talking about very different things. And are we overburdening that definition when we expect, for example, a solar lantern to be providing economic benefits to a household? We're looking for the wrong things sometimes. So maybe this whole sort of question about who benefits the sample we're looking at, whether we're asking the right questions of the right samples. Maybe we could have a response for the panel on that. Clark, have you got your hand up, or you just didn't take it down?
I do.
You do. Okay.
I do, and I just want to highlight. You know, we often think about energy access, and especially in remote areas, but even in cities and developing countries, as a different problem from thinking about energy and its relationship to poverty in you know, wealthier, long electrified parts of the world. But I just would remind us that in North America and in Europe and in the wealthier parts of Asia, you know, we often see, well, let me say, we see growing mountains of evidence that for the lowest 10% in terms of the population, in terms of income, that the energy system as currently designed is a significant detractor from economic opportunity and thriving for those households, right? And so that tells, you know, us that when we design these energy systems, we do have to pay very close attention to thinking about who we're enabling to create net positive social value, to put it in our language, but really to, you know, for whom is the energy system net a burden versus who is it net a benefit, and to worry very much about creating communities wherever we're building energy systems that aren't able to benefit, and that even in many cases see their lives detracted by various features of how existing energy systems operate.
Thanks, Clark. But Ken?
So I just wanted to address this question of who benefits from electricity access. So in our field work, when we were in rural Kenya, just sort of overseeing these connections of these households, one of the questions that sometimes came up in our discussions was, you know, is it going to be the case that there are some households in some of these rural villages that are able to take advantage of these power connections much faster than their neighbors and actually earn income from it? And will this somehow exacerbate local equality? So an example is, you might have a very entrepreneurial person figuring out very quickly, as soon as they get a power connection, let me run a business of charging mobile phones, which was a very popular idea at the time of our study. So we tried to explore some of these questions of heterogeneous treatment effects in our sample. And what we found was that we found very suggestive evidence. We had issues with statistical power, but we found suggestive evidence that people who were willing to pay more for a power connection at baseline, and which was tended to be correlated with higher education levels or higher income levels at baseline, tended to be making more use out of the power connections, just in terms of things like monthly spending, some of the accumulation of electrical appliances. There was even some suggestive differences on employment. And so we had some suggestive evidence that there are people who benefit more and more quickly from power connections. And so what does this mean for policy? Well, I think it means that if you're a government and you're prioritizing delivering universal access to power in some of these rural areas, knowing that there are certain households that could really take advantage of this pretty quickly, it raises the stakes to make sure that when you design these universal access programs, you're finding ways to make that power easily consumed, affordable, useful to everyone. And so just delivering power connections and leaving that as it is, perhaps that leads to issues of local inequality. So I kind of interpret it as just raising the stakes to make sure that these complementarities are taken care of.
But I mean, just to sort of put my question again another way, Ken, because I'm just wondering whether we should always be looking for the economic benefits from an electricity connection in the first place, whether, you know, particularly when we're looking at these sort of very low levels that you see in East Africa, for example, with the sort of pay-as-you-go solar home systems or solar lights. Should we be trying to sort of highlight maybe a sort of different quality of life perspective as being a valid benefit in its own right, to sort of light at night, security, being able to run a radio, charge your own phone, rather than trying to prove that at all levels of energy access there is these sort of greater employment and health and education and benefits? Are we not asking the wrong question sometimes?
Yeah. So the way I see it is that, you know, it's hard to imagine any kind of modern successful life without access to power. So the question really isn't like, should governments build power connections or not? Of course they should. But we need to focus on benefits, whether these are economic benefits, non-economic benefits, because these are expensive investments, and you need these investments to generate returns to the investors. And there are ways to do that. Like, you could do that by just ensuring that you've designed a program in the best way possible. And the reason why that's important is because as much as we think electrification infrastructure is permanent, it's not as permanent as roads. If you go into a rural area where you've got very extreme environmental conditions, if you're not generating revenue off of those connections that is going to pay for maintenance of that grid is going to stop working in a few years or in a decade, and then no one's benefiting. So it's in the interest of the government, the utilities, the donors, to make sure that these kinds of infrastructure investments are generating revenue, are returning benefits, and are allowing that infrastructure to be properly maintained so that it lasts a long time and it leads to overall economic development. So I think that we do need to focus on whether there are tangible benefits, visible benefits, measurable benefits that are coming from these investments. Because if we don't, then there's a risk that there's a long delay in anything happening and this equipment stops working.
Okay. I'm going to ask a sort of question focusing back again on enterprise creation for a minute, and then we might then just do one more dip into the Q&As to see if there's any other questions from the audience. So Dana, I think you found in your research in Indonesia that electrification sort of, I think you were saying, led to a churn in firms, and sort of older, less efficient manufacturers were replaced with newer ones that were perhaps able to take advantage, I guess, of more sophisticated tools and equipments that came, you know, that were usable once electrification became possible. But the numbers of manufacturing workers also increased, I think. So increases in efficiency brought about by electrification didn't result in a reduction in the number of jobs. Is that correct in the Indonesian example? That employment overall increased?
Yes. So the firms, the newer firms were also larger, so they employed more people. So that's what I find.
Okay.
Yeah, I would like to tell you more about where these workers are coming from, but I only had data on the manufacturing sector, so I don't know exactly. But I can tell you that, I mean, Indonesia was sort of mostly agricultural, so a lot of these workers would be coming from the agriculture sector. Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a thread open to the panel as a whole, but I think there's an sort of interesting discussion here around net versus sort of gross job creation, and whether whether access to electricity always results through improvements in productivity to more jobs, or whether there are occasions where through improvements in productivity require less labor.
Yeah.
And there are examples of that.
Yeah. So, but one point I would like to add as well is that these workers could be coming from the informal sector, and these are firms that are formalizing, and we start seeing them in the data because it's just they're growing and they're becoming formal. They're joining the formal sector, which has benefits for the workers as well. So. And I do observe that even though the firms do use capital more intensively, because capital is naturally more complementary to energy than labor, but sort of the growth or the scale effect, it was large enough, at least in the context of Indonesia, to create more jobs instead of sort of the firms reducing their size in terms of number of workers.
Has anybody on the panel seen the reverse, where electrification has sort of led to improvements in productivity that have reduced employment as a result? Theoretically, that's possible, one presumes. Moving from hand irrigation to irrigation through electric pumps, or I think there was some evidence from of rice drying technologies putting people out of traditional jobs in the past, but it's not something that anybody's seen. No? Okay.
I mean, for some of the studies, the timescales may also be too short, right? And I think if you're asking the right questions, which are moving beyond, maybe it's also in some of your earlier questions, but restating it a little bit, like moving beyond, can we see individual household incomes increase? In a sense, what we ought to be interested in are the sort of structural changes in local economies, right? So maybe it's sufficient that people move out of low-paying jobs, and then we need to know where they're moving to. Maybe it's efficient if they don't hand dry rice anymore, and that there's a machine doing that now. The question we should be asking is, so about complementarities are maybe another lever, or market access is another lever, but how they change the structure of local economy. And maybe it's efficient that many of these people lose jobs in villages and they end up going to towns, right? As we've seen the structural transformation happening in many economies. I think that's where we should be asking the questions, but that is a question in a sense of scale as well. We know at the macro level that when energy access has expanded, if we believe the identification, let's leave the discussion for a second alone, believe that, then we know that they positively correlate with each other, that great expansion tends to increase economic activities and raise, housing prices, etc. But we don't see it yet at the micro scale. But it's also that we, Ken's evaluation window was 5 years, and maybe the answer to that, is we wanted to study that very well, is to put the question we started with on complementarities in the pressure cooker. Just as much as you want to learn about subsidized access, it's maybe indeed, economists would think about subsidized appliances, helping overcome transaction costs in markets. So you could see what that looks like.
One final question, and we'll go back to the Q&A just briefly. Some other research that the EEG is financing at the moment through Winrock International in Nepal has provided some. It's looking at the sort of impact of rural grid electrification on enterprise creation, and some of the preliminary data that they're coming back with suggests that there's quite a long sort of tail or period between access to electricity and actual uptick in the number of enterprises being created. And the data is not completely analysed yet, but initial sort of looks suggest anywhere from 2 years to longer between energy access actually being provided in a location, and you beginning to see that sort of uptick in terms of business and enterprise. And I know a number of you sort of mentioned the sort of from a study or research perspective, are we always looking at the right window of sort of time when we're looking for impacts? And I just wonder whether anybody else in their research had seen these sort of time delays between access and an enterprise pickup.
I mean, I do clearly see that in my research, that it's very slow, the increase in manufacturing output. It's the same thing also applies to like the change in energy use at the firm level. So even when the grid just arrives, firms are still generating some electricity, and then that decreases over time the generation share. So there is definitely some of that in Indonesia.
Cool. We are running really short on time now, and I'm going to ask you all, just to give you advance warning, I'm going to ask you all for a sort of takeaway from the discussion today. But I just wanted to take one more opportunity to dip into the questions from the audience to see if there's something there, Ben, that we could pull out.
I think there is one question that builds on what we were just talking about a moment ago, and it's this question of distribution, causality, time lags. In some sense, to what extent does the electricity supply, or is it the demand for electricity that drives this potential impact that electrification may have? And the other issue we're seeing, and was highlighted here in the comments, but also by the IEA today in their launch of the World Energy Outlook, is that the world seems to have lost momentum on access to electricity due to the pandemic, and we're seeing perhaps inequalities broaden. So this question, who benefits when, is I think something we're seeing here, both from the audience and what you were raising in your comments just a moment ago.
Anybody want to respond to that? Quite a general question by the sound of it. I think we've done the who already. I mean, maybe picking up on the when and the sense that we might be, is there evidence that we are going backwards post COVID pandemic, that we're losing momentum? Do any of you have that sense from your work? Is it too early to say? Looks like it's too early to say.
I can respond from the perspective of our engagement in Sierra Leone, but it's completely related to reprioritization of donors. So, there's a market shift in particularly UK is a big donor of this, and it's a market shift in their emphasis on aid versus trade, but some other donors at the same time we see becoming more interested, particularly the European Union and the Japanese, and I think the USAID as well. So yeah, I can't say, but I mean, many of these agendas will be looked at in terms of what are priorities in aid. But I do see a shift, if you took a longer perspective, is a refocus on sort of these structural impediments to economic growth, where we've had a phase where it's all I'm making it simple here, but the previous phase maybe said it was all institutional, or maybe it's geography versus institutions, and it seems like a return to focus on these structural impediments to growth. So think about infrastructure and roads, and so that's a positive sign.
Okay, thank you, Robin, and then Clark.
Yeah. So as I interpreted Martin's comments, he was talking about more from the donor perspective and sort of financing going towards energy access. I was thinking about it from a different perspective of in the places where there already is electricity access, how that access will be impacted going forward in terms of, because of the impacts that the pandemic has had on people's ability to pay and make payments to, whether it be that whatever their electricity source is, whether it be a micro hydro mini grid or whether it be the grid and they're paying to a distribution company, those impacts of I think my sense is, and this is from the EEG funded work that we have ongoing in Pakistan, my sense is that that people's ability to make payments for their electricity has been impacted, by the pandemic. And I think it's a bit too early to say, from my perspective, what will be the longer term impacts of that on these distribution companies or mini grid providers. But I think there is an impact that's happening there.
Yeah, no, good point. Clark, and then we'll do a wrap up.
I would just highlight that the cost is also going to be a factor, and we're seeing in every facet of the global economy, but especially right now in the energy sector, that prices for everything are going up. They're going up because of challenges in global supply chains. They're going up because of resurgent economies that are soaking up what little inventory had been left when production shut down, and all of that is increasing prices for solar panels. It's increasing prices for gas supplies, and I would be shocked if that didn't get passed through into these kind of projects. And we're talking about many projects being on the edge financially to begin with, in terms of the ability to make them work financially. And that higher cost regime is, I suspect, going to create pushback on a lot of these projects until prices return, if prices return to lower levels.
Okay, another good point. Okay, so we're coming to the end now. I'll say my thanks in a minute, but before I do that, I'd just like to go around all of you once more. And I guess it's two questions. It's a key takeaway from the discussion today from your perspective, but also maybe within that, if you have any pointers to research gaps that you think still need to be tackled, or prioritized, but in order to understand the factors most influencing whether or not electricity leads to social or economic development, or the fact, to understand the factors that most influence whether that actually happens. So your takeaways and any thoughts on research gaps. Maybe let's go roughly the same order as I started, if I can remember it. So we'll start with Ken.
First of all, I just want to thank you for inviting me, and thank the other panelists. It was really a pleasure to participate in this discussion. I spoke a lot about complementarities, so I really won't go into that. But what I thought was interesting from this was hearing everyone's different research, and then just thinking about how we often think of electrification and development as if electrification is one thing. But we're really talking about a whole range of different kinds of interventions, from household access to regional power programs to off-grid, versus the grid, and so on. And so I think that this is an area where a lot of the results truly depend on the context and the ways that these programs are designed, and so we have to keep that in mind as we try to synthesize and make sense of all of the different kinds of results that we're seeing. I think that there's really space for a lot of different kinds of outcomes, and really boils down to all of these differences in what that electrification variable means on the right-hand side of the equation. Thank you.
Okay. And do you have a particular area where you think we should be putting more money into research in the future?
I think absolutely. Just going back to this complementarities thing, I think that we really should be thinking of electricity as an enabling technology. It's sort of useless unless there are ways to use it. And so I would love to see future research systematically tackling these interactions between electricity access and other kinds of complementary inputs. And I think that this relates not just to this field of electrification and development, but to the broader field of infrastructure economics. That's sort of the direction that I think I'd love to see, and this would have great benefits to donors and policymakers who are thinking about how to roll out some of these investments, given that something like 500 million people still lack access to electricity in sub-Saharan Africa.
Okay, thank you. Martin.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks everyone. It was truly inspiring. And I think that where the thread started on complementarities, I think it came back throughout some of the discussion. So I thought that was, a good thing that Ken started to raise. And I think we all were able to chime in on, and that also changes the way I think we ought to be thinking about the problem. That ties directly into your second question. So before you ask it, I think that the emphasis has at some point to move away from sort of does it change things for a business or for a group of businesses towards how do we think about local economies changing? And that requires us thinking about complementarities more than just energy dependent appliances. I raised the issue of access to markets, but it also places, in a sense, your research funding and your analysis strategy at a much more sort of, aggregate level, right? So we ought to be thinking about how does a equilibrium shift from one place to another, which needs us to define what local economies are, but it also needs us to think about longer run changes. So we shouldn't be limited on, can we have an EEG window, let's say for 3 years? What we're interested in contributing to is how things change over a longer time frame. But that's a daring strategy. But it touches on all these elements that relate to structure of economies, as well as health and economic outcomes. I don't want to dwindle their importance.
Thank you. Adana.
Yeah, so I was going to give you my spiel about how we need to study more the interaction between barriers to access to energy and other market failures. But I think my fellow panelists, they covered that already. One point I would like to make, which is actually from Ken's research, is that electricity, and they find that, and correct me please, Ken, if I'm wrong, is that the one positive effect you found was that people are happier. The life satisfaction has increased a lot, and I think this should be part of the discussion. And it's very difficult for us economists to quantify that. And maybe we should talk to people from other fields to learn ways on how to include that in part of our evaluation of access to electricity and its impact. Thank you.
That's an interesting comment. Maybe talk to people that are investigating well-being as a sort of complementarity itself. Robin.
Great. Well, thank you very much for including me today. I appreciate the opportunity. So for takeaways, I think building on this discussion that we've had about the complementarities, I think, I would just say that location matters. And I think that's sort of one thing that I take away from a bunch of the research, and not just sort of thinking about sort of cross countries and sort of impacts of electrification across different countries, but sort of thinking about even within a country, right? So proximity to markets and things like that are going to matter when we think about sort of what might be the impacts of electrifying a certain location. And then in terms of sort of research gaps and sort of future research, as I mentioned, sort of building on this point about sustaining the functionality of infrastructure or sort of mini grids, I think this is an area that we still, as I said, I think it's really complex, and I think we don't know much about it. And I think better understanding sort of what factors or sort of what can be done to better ensure that mini grids or infrastructure continues to provide high quality service and continues to function, I think is a really important area of future research.
Okay, so reliability is key here as well, ensuring reliability. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Robin. And Clark.
Yeah, thanks also from me for the opportunity to be here and to be part of this fantastic discussion. I really liked the key takeaways that Ken and Martin highlighted in terms of thinking about this as a kind of integrated problem in which we're paying as much attention to the human side as we are to the technical side. I guess what I would highlight, therefore, as a gap is an opportunity to both for innovation and for research is to think about policy strategies that could, or donor strategies or whatever, that could incentivize or require project developers to attend carefully to the question of how they're going to make sure that economic growth accompanies project development, for thinking about how they could be held accountable for those outcomes, for thinking about how we could hold communities harmless if those outcomes don't occur, right? So how do we not saddle communities with expensive electricity systems that have not generated economic growth for them, right? And then finally, how do we account in kind of project design and evaluation for this temporality of growth, the fact that it's slow? How do we create that space that allows for that to happen over time and doesn't impose very high levels of costs on communities from the get-go, that are ultimately payable once that economic development and growth has begun to occur, but are not payable before then, and which, if we require them to pay beforehand, might undermine those very opportunities.
Thank you, Clark. Just in conclusion, I want to thank all of the panelists for their contribution today: Clark, Dana, Kenneth, Robin, and Martin. I think it's been a really interesting conversation. I want to highlight that we actually do have another one coming up next month, which will actually be from the fringes of COP in Glasgow, and will be around the trade in renewable power, cross-border trade in renewable power, and its advantages and disadvantages. And again, we'll be trying to draw on EEG research for that. I want to thank all of the audience that were with us today. We had a great number, and thank you for all of your questions. And yeah, thanks. Thanks to Ben for also compiling all of those, and our moderator, and of course thanks to Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office for funding EEG from the first place. But thank you very much all for attending, and particularly, as I said again, thanks to the panelists. I really enjoyed that conversation, and it was some really interesting takeaways, I think, as well for us to think about. This will go on our website as a recording, and we will probably try and pull some sort of short paper out of it as well, to highlight some of the discussion and conclusions. But thank you very much. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.